Aboard occupied European docks in 1941, British commandos needed more than bravery. A rifle was useless in a corridor, and a pistol was too slow against panic and steel. That is when a heavy, ugly British contraption changed everything, firing so relentlessly that entire ship decks were cleared in seconds. His very presence promised instant dominance in close combat, even as better-known weapons fell short. Why did this overlooked invention strike such terror in its enemies, and what urgent crisis forced Britain to build it at any cost? The answer begins in the wake of disaster, where survival meant inventing fear itself. After the last boats pulled away from Dunkirk's burning beaches in June 1940, the scale of the loss became impossible to ignore. Nearly all heavy equipment had been abandoned, including over 68,000 vehicles, thousands of field guns, and almost every automatic weapon. British forces returned across the Channel with little more than their uniforms, Lee Enfield rifles and sidearms. For the Royal Navy and the RAF Regiment, the problem was immediate and acute. The war had shifted into a new phase, one defined by sudden raids, boarding actions, and the constant threat of German landings. Yet the only weapons available to face these close-quarters threats were bolt-action rifles, designed for open fields, and pistols that offered little more than a handful of shots under pressure. Inside the Admiralty's war rooms, urgency coloured every conversation. Reports from the docks and airfields painted a grim picture. Sailors and airmen forced to clear ships or defend runways with weapons that were too slow, too long, or simply too few. The American Thompson submachine gun, with its compact size and rapid fire, had proven its worth, but supplies were limited, and the cost was staggering, more than 5 times what the British could afford for wide issue. Quests for more Thompsons piled up, but the numbers delivered were a trickle compared to the need. There was no British-made alternative. The Royal Small Arms factory at Enfield had never produced a domestic submachine gun. Early experiments, like the T-40 prototypes, were still unproven and unsuited for the harsh, salt-soaked environments of naval service. The Sten gun was still a paper concept, months away from production, and plagued by doubts about its reliability. In the meantime, frontline units improvised using whatever weapons they could scavenge. For the men tasked with storming enemy-held ships or holding the line in the labyrinth of a dockyard, improvisation was a thin shield. The absence of a reliable, homegrown submachine gun was more than a technical gap. It was a threat to every operation that demanded speed and overwhelming force in confined spaces. The pressure on Britain's ordnance designers was relentless. Every delay meant another boarding party sent in with little more than hope and a bolt-action rifle, while the enemy held the advantage with automatic weapons tailored for close combat. In the shadow of Dunkirk, the call was clear. Britain needed a weapon that could reclaim the initiative, one that could turn the tables in the narrowest corridors and darkest holds. The search for such a weapon would have to begin immediately, with no margin for error and no time for half measures. The Lee Enfield rifle stretches more than 44 inches from butt to muzzle. In the tight confines of a ship's passageway, that is nearly a third of the available space. Training officers at Portsmouth tested the problem firsthand. 2 men, each armed with a standard rifle, attempted to round a steel-cornered corridor at speed. The lead man's barrel scraped bulkheads, snagged on door frames, and forced him to break his firing stance just to turn. Attempting to bring the weapon to bear in a hurry, he found himself wrestling the length of the gun more than the imagined enemy. Every movement telegraphed his position, the bolt action a noisy, deliberate process that left him exposed after each shot. Pistols offered no real answer. The standard-issue Webley revolver, loaded with just 6 rounds, demanded a steady hand and nerves of steel. In practice, most trainees struggled to land more than 2 or 3 hits under the pressure of simulated attack. The weapon's short sight radius and heavy trigger pull punished anyone who fired too quickly. Reloading in a confined space with spent casings clattering to the deck wasted precious seconds. In the chaos of a boarding action or a dockside skirmish, those seconds could mean the difference between clearing a hatch and being pinned behind it. Ship interiors and dock warehouses amplified every flaw. Rifles became unwieldy poles, impossible to swing in a crowded passage. Pistols, while compact, lacked the firepower to suppress a determined group or hold a corridor against a sudden rush. Training reports from late 1940 described repeated failures, boarding parties forced to abandon rifles mid-action, officers relying on sidearms until ammunition ran dry. The geometry of steel corridors turned every approach into a bottleneck where speed and overwhelming force were the only currency. The standard arms of the British services, designed for open fields and parade grounds, simply could not deliver either. The gap was no longer theoretical. Each failed accident, each after-action report sharpened the demand for a weapon that could dominate at arm's length, deliver sustained fire, and restore confidence to men fighting in the most claustrophobic corners of the war. The solution would have to be something entirely new, purpose-built for control and authority, and survival in the steel maze below deck. The Admiralty's accounts from 1940 and 1941 read like a running battle with arithmetic. Each new batch of American Thompsons arrived with a price tag that could not be ignored, over £50 per gun, a sum that dwarfed the cost of any British rifle or pistol then in service. At that rate, a single crate of Thompsons could equal the monthly wage bill for a destroyer's entire crew. Finance officers pressed for answers flagged the numbers in red ink. Reports from the Ministry of Supply made the situation plain. Even with Lend-Lease, the United States could not deliver enough Thompsons to arm every boarding party, every dock patrol, every airfield sentry. The trickle of deliveries fell far short of the flood of requisitions crossing their desks. The gap between demand and supply was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Navy and RAF commanders, faced with the prospect of sending men into close combat with nothing but rifles or sidearms, pressed their case with increasing urgency. Internal memos from the Admiralty's Ordnance Branch, dated autumn 1940, warned that relying on imported submachine guns was simply unsustainable. The cost per unit was unsupportable for mass issue. Worse, the Americans had their own priorities, and British orders were routinely delayed or cut down to a fraction of what was needed. By the end of 1940, the numbers told their own story. Less than 1,000 Thompsons had reached Royal Navy hands, and the RAF regiment's share was even smaller. The rest was scattered in penny packets across commando units and rear area security details. Each new shipment disappeared as quickly as it arrived, with no prospect of scaling up. The Treasury's ledgers showed a mounting deficit, and every debate over procurement circled back to the same hard truth: imported firepower, no matter how effective, could never fill the void on its own. The pressure to find a homegrown answer reached its breaking point. The Royal Small Arms factory at Enfield was instructed to move beyond experiments and deliver a weapon that could be built in Britain, for British needs, at a price that would not bankrupt the war effort. The era of relying on expensive American imports was over. The search for a domestically produced submachine gun was no longer just a technical challenge. It was a matter of survival for every man ordered to fight at close quarters on the home front and beyond. Designers at the Royal Small Arms factory faced a brutal deadline. The need for a close-quarters weapon was not just urgent, it was immediate. Rather than start from scratch, they turned to a proven template, the German MP-28. British intelligence had secured captured examples, and teams of draftsmen at Enfield set to work, measuring, sketching and disassembling every component. Each spring, pin and receiver was mapped out, with special attention paid to how the weapon handled automatic fire in tight spaces. The MP-28 had earned a reputation for reliability and control in the hands of German police and border troops. Its simple blowback mechanism, sturdy construction, and large capacity magazine were exactly what British naval and airfield units required. Reverse engineering the MP-28 was not a matter of pride, but of survival. The British team, led by experienced draftsmen and toolmakers, reinforced the design at every critical point. They thickened the receiver walls, replaced lighter alloys with solid steel, and adapted the magazine housing for corrosion resistance, crucial for life at sea. The weapon's wooden stock was modelled after the familiar SMLE rifle, easing the transition for sailors and airmen already trained on British small arms. The team made subtle changes to accommodate local manufacturing methods, but the heart of the gun remained true to its German origin. This decision to copy and improve saved months of experimental dead ends. Instead of chasing untested concepts, Enfield's engineers could focus on immediate production and field trials. The MP-28's proven track record meant fewer surprises during testing, and the reinforced British version promised even greater durability. In a war where time was as valuable as steel, adopting a blueprint that already worked allowed the Royal Navy and RAF Regiment to arm their men with confidence, and to do so before the next crisis hit. The Lanchester's lineage was no secret, but its transformation at Enfield has turned a captured idea into a weapon built for British hands and British battles. Machinists at Enfield faced a clear directive: build a weapon that would survive the worst a warship or dockyard could offer. Each Lanchester receiver started life as a solid billet of steel, not a stamped sheet. Skilled hands and heavy lathes shaped every contour, leaving walls so thick that even years of salt spray and rough handling would barely scratch the surface. The decision to machine rather than stamp was not about tradition, it was a direct answer to the corrosive realities of naval service. Early reports from the Admiralty warned that weapons exposed to salt air and humid holds quickly failed if corners were cut. Rust, pitting and warped components could turn a submachine gun into dead weight at the worst possible moment. Engineers doubled down on durability. The magazine housing, for example, was cast in bronze, a material chosen for its resistance to corrosion, even if it meant more time at the foundry and higher costs. The wooden stock, borrowed from the trusted SMLE rifle, gave the weapon a familiar heft and absorbed shock when fired from the shoulder. Even the smallest fittings, from the trigger guard to the selector switch, were overbuilt compared to their continental rivals. Where the German MP-28 used lighter alloys and the Sten would soon rely on stamped parts to speed up production, the Lanchester was a study in deliberate overengineering. This approach came at a price. Each Lanchester required hours of skilled labour and careful inspection before it left the factory floor. Production numbers would never rival the Sten, but the Admiralty was clear. Quality trumped quantity. Their boarding parties needed a weapon that would function after weeks at sea after being dropped on steel decks, or after exposure to brackish water in a flooded hold. The Lanchester's robust construction was not just a technical feature, it was a guarantee that, when the time came to clear a corridor or hold a hatch, the weapon would fire as intended, no matter the conditions. In June 1941, the Admiralty put pen to paper and issued a contract that would lock the Lanchester into production. The order, signed mid-month, called for 50,000 submachine guns, an ambitious figure that underscored just how urgently the Royal Navy needed a weapon built for its own battle spaces. The specifications left no room for compromise: corrosion-resistant finishes, a robust magazine housing, and a bayonet lug for close-quarters control. This was not a weapon to be rushed out for the lowest bidder. Instead, the contract demanded the kind of craftsmanship that could withstand life at sea, even if it meant higher costs and longer build times. Procurement officers at the Admiralty worked closely with the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, but the scale of the task required more than just a single government plant. Management of the main production run fell to the Sterling Armament Company, a firm already familiar with precision machining and military contracts. Sterling coordinated a network of more than 40 subcontractors, each responsible for turning out parts that met strict naval standards. Every receiver, magazine and bolt would pass through a chain of inspection before final assembly. This distributed approach mirrored the urgency of the times. Speed was essential, but not at the expense of reliability. The timeline was relentless. From the moment the contract was signed, Sterling and its partners had just 12 months to move from prototype to full-scale issue. The pressure filtered down to every level of the supply chain. Engineering teams worked double shifts, machinists cut steel light into the night, and inspectors logged each finished component against Admiralty requirements. By the summer of 1942, completed Lanchesters began arriving at naval depots, ready to arm boarding parties and dockside patrols. The weapon was no longer an experiment or a promise. It was now a fact of war, delivered by a procurement system that had traded bureaucracy for action. Unloaded, the Lanchester weighed just under 10 pounds, nearly half again, as much as the Sten gun that would soon become a household name. That heft, unusual for a submachine gun, was no accident. Every ounce served a purpose: to keep the muzzle steady, to tame recoil, and to let a sailor or airman fire controlled bursts without losing his grip in the chaos of a steel corridor. The weapon's rate of fire was set at 600 rounds per minute, fast enough to lay down overwhelming firepower, but measured enough that each shot could be placed with intent. The balance struck here was deliberate. Too slow, and the enemy might recover between bursts. Too fast, and the gun would buck out of control, wasting precious ammunition in a panic of wasted shots. The magazine capacity completed the equation. Standard issue was a 50-round box, long and heavy, designed to minimize reloads when movement was restricted or hands were gloved and wet. For those who needed a lighter load, a 32-round option was available, compatible with Sten logistics. Both fed the same 9mm parabellum rounds, a practical nod to supply lines and the possibility of using captured enemy ammunition if needed. In sum, the Lanchester's core numbers, nearly 10 pounds, 600 rounds per minute, up to 50 rounds before a reload, anchored its reputation as a weapon built to control not just a firefight, but the very space in which it erupted. Inside the Lanchester, every component was laid out with one goal in mind: to survive the harshest conditions and deliver reliable fire when it mattered most. The heart of the weapon was its massive steel receiver, machined from a solid billet with walls nearly twice as thick as those found on its German ancestor, the MP-28. This reinforced tube housed a heavy open bolt system, designed to cycle smoothly even after weeks at sea or rough handling on a steel deck, and to provide reliable operation in adverse conditions. The bolt itself was a solid chunk of steel, its weight working in tandem with the receiver to absorb recoil and keep the muzzle steady during bursts, providing stability where control mattered. Feeding this mechanism was a unique magazine housing cast from corrosion-resistant bronze. This choice was not about saving weight, it was about withstanding salt air and humidity, ensuring the feed path remained smooth and durable. The magazine locked in from the left side, guiding 9mm parabellum rounds into the chamber with a positive, deliberate motion. The feed ramp and ejector were both overbuilt, minimizing the risk of jams even with dirty or worn ammunition. Blueprints from Enfield show careful attention to every detail. The barrel was secured within a heavy shroud, vented for cooling and lined up perfectly with the receiver for consistent accuracy. The fire selector, located just ahead of the trigger guard, allowed for both single and automatic fire in early models. Each part was machined and fitted with the kind of precision normally reserved for rifles, not mass-produced submachine guns. The result was a weapon that felt solid in the hands, its architecture promising that, when the trigger was pulled, it would answer with authority every time. A test shooter braces the Lanchester against his shoulder, feet planted on the concrete range floor. The timer beeps. At 5 meters, a steel plate waits. The first burst, 3 rounds fully automatic, cracks out at 600 rounds per minute. The muzzle barely lifts. On the slow-motion playback, the barrel rise is measured in centimeters, not inches. The heavy steel receiver and full wooden stock soak up the recoil, keeping the sights almost flat on target. Each shot lands within a hand's width of the last, demonstrating control. Next comes the Sten. Lighter by nearly 3 pounds, the Sten's burst is sharp and abrupt. The muzzle jumps higher, the shooter's support hand working to keep the barrel down. On the metric overlay, the Sten's muzzle climbs nearly twice as far as the Lanchester's in the same 3-round burst. Even at this short range, reacquiring the target takes noticeably longer, and it undermines accuracy. The German MP-40 follows. Its stamped construction and folding stock make it handy, but the lighter frame allows more upward drift. The muzzle rise sits between the Sten and the Lanchester, but the shooter's grip shifts with each burst. Data from high-speed footage confirms the pattern. The Lanchester's weight and balance produce the least muzzle climb, the tightest grouping, and the fastest return to aim. In the chaos of a ship's corridor or a crowded dock, that stability turns short. Controlled bursts into overwhelming authority. Ammunition supply in close combat is more than just a matter of numbers. It can determine who controls a corridor or who survives a boarding. The Lanchester's distinctive 50-round magazine, long, brass-sided, and built for endurance, gave boarding parties the ability to keep firing when movement and visibility were at their worst. Each magazine locked in from the left, seating with a solid click that reassured even the most nervous hands. For those who needed a lighter load or faster handling, 32-round magazines were also issued, fully compatible with the Sten, which would soon fill British armouries. The real advantage came in confined spaces. where reloading could mean exposure. A single 50-round box let a sailor clear a compartment or hold a hatch under fire, buying precious seconds before a pause was forced. Keeping these magazines running demanded more than brute strength. Each was designed to be loaded with a simple tool, a magazine loader that let fingers avoid sharp feed lips and heavy springs. In the hands of an experienced armourer, a full reload could be completed in half the time it took with a Thompson or a German MP40. The magazines themselves were engineered for naval life, with heavy gauge metal and a phosphate finish to resist corrosion from salt and humidity. Even after weeks at sea, they fed rounds smoothly, a small but vital insurance against the chaos of a jammed feed. This was reliable equipment, built for reliability. The Lanchester's final statement of intent was the bayonet lug, machined directly into the barrel shroud. No other submachine gun of the era paired automatic fire with a full-length bayonet. This feature was not for show, it was a signal to friend and foe alike that the weapon and its users were prepared to dominate every inch of contested space. A Royal Navy boarding team, boots echoing on the steel deck, moved single file toward the forward hold of a seized freighter. The lead man cradled a Lanchester, magazine locked and bayonet fixed, eyes adjusting to the gloom. In the narrow passage every sound carried. The team's orders were clear: secure the manifest, sweep for hidden crew and do it fast. In these spaces, rifles were useless, too long to swing, too slow to bring to bear. The Lanchester's weight pressed into the sailor's shoulder, reassuring in its solidity. One squeeze of the trigger, and a burst of 9mm rounds hammered down the corridor, echoing off the bulkheads. The effect was immediate. Any resistance melted away, the threat of sustained fire in such close quarters proving overwhelming before a single man could rally a defence. On the docks at Portsmouth, warehouse patrols faced a different kind of tension. German sabotage teams had been spotted slipping through the maze of crates and cranes under cover of darkness. Patrols moved in pairs, Lanchesters at the ready, each man trusting that the 50-round magazine would carry them through any sudden contact. In one recorded incident from 1942, a sentry heard footsteps behind a stack of crates. No time for challenge or warning. A brief controlled burst from the Lanchester scattered the intruders, the volume of fire enough to convince them the odds had turned. Reports from these dock actions often noted the same pattern. The weapon's presence alone shifted the balance, its heavy construction and capacity making it clear that the defenders could hold their ground without pause to reload or reposition. RAF Regiment detachments at coastal airfields relied on the same principles. When alarms sounded and shadows moved beyond the wire, defenders manoeuvred between hangars and fuel dumps with Lanchesters at the ready. Airfield logs from late 1941 describe sudden engagements where the weapon stability under fire allowed defenders to sweep open doors and clear corners without hesitation. The heavy receiver and full-length stock made it possible to control recoil even when firing one-handed around obstacles. Time and again, after-action notes credited the Lanchester's design with restoring confidence to men who had once felt exposed in the chaos of a night raid. Across these engagements, ship holds, dock warehouses and airfields, the same truth repeated itself. The Lanchester was not a weapon for open fields or long patrols. Its true value appeared in the moments when space was measured in paces, when every second counted, and when the only path to survival was to seize control with relentless authoritative force. German defenders in occupied ports and airfields wrote about the sudden, crushing violence that swept through confined spaces during British raids. After-action notes, translated from captured documents, described the experience in blunt terms: a burst of automatic fire erupting from nowhere, echoing off steel and stone, leaving no time to pinpoint the source or mount an organised response. In narrow corridors or cramped storerooms, the first sign of attack was often a wall of noise and splinters, not a warning shout or the crack of a single rifle. One Wehrmacht sergeant, recounting an encounter in a French dockyard, wrote that he heard a heavy, deliberate burst from the darkness, far slower than the chatter of a Sten or MP40, but impossible to outlast. The rounds came in measured groups, not wild sprays, and filled the passage so completely that defenders could not tell if a single man or an entire squad was firing. In those moments, the instinct was not to fight back but to find cover, any cover, and hope the storm would pass. Attempts to return fire often ended before they began. The Lanchester's weight and slow, methodical rhythm made it seem as if the shooter had all the time in the world, while the defenders felt trapped in a shrinking box. Reports from German naval detachments at occupied harbours echo the same pattern. Patrols caught in the open by boarding parties armed with Lanchesters described a sense of being outmatched before they could even raise their weapons. The magazine's capacity meant the British could keep firing through the first seconds of chaos, while defenders scrambled to reload or locate the attacker. One after-action summary from 1942 notes that defenders were unable to determine the number or position of attackers before being forced to withdraw. The volume and persistence of fire created the impression of overwhelming numbers, even when only a handful of men advanced. The psychological effect went beyond casualties. German officers reported that the prospect of facing British boarding teams armed with these heavy submachine guns changed the way they assigned men to guard duties in vulnerable areas. Choke points that once felt defensible now seemed like traps. The certainty of being met by a weapon that could dominate an entire corridor in seconds left many with a simple choice: retreat or risk being cut down before they could react. For the men on the receiving end, the Lanchester was not just another enemy weapon. It was a promise that resistance in close quarters would be brief, loud, and almost always futile. Accountants at the Admiralty and Ministry of Supply faced a dilemma as the first Lanchesters rolled off the assembly line. Each weapon cost the government roughly £14, a steep figure in 1941, especially when compared to the Sten's eventual £2 to £4 price tag. The difference was not just a matter of raw materials. The Lanchester demanded hours of skilled machining, from the thick-walled steel receiver to the corrosion-resistant bronze magazine housing. Subcontractors across more than 40 firms handled parts ranging from stocks to bolts, each piece inspected to meet naval standards. The result was a weapon that could survive salt spray and rough handling, but came with a price that limited its reach. Production totals reflected this trade-off. Enfield and its partners delivered somewhere between 22,000 and 28,000 Lanchesters by the end of the war, depending on which audit you consult. The numbers never approached the millions churned out for the Sten. Procurement officials understood this was not a flaw, it was a deliberate choice. The Lanchester was never intended to fill the hands of every infantryman or be dropped by the crate into resistant strongholds. Instead, it was a specialist tool reserved for the Royal Navy's boarding parties, dock patrols, and the Royal Air Force Regiment's airfield defenders. Each unit received weapons matched precisely to its operational need, not to a one-size-fits-all doctrine. Auditors reviewing Sterling's cost ledgers and Enfield's production schedules found that the Lanchester's expense was justified only in the narrowest of roles. Its robust build and reliability paid off where failure was not an option, but the war's scale demanded cheaper, faster solutions elsewhere. The Sten's stamped parts and bare-bones design allowed Britain to arm millions at a fraction of the cost, even if it meant accepting a higher risk of jams and breakages in the field. For the Lanchester, the balance was always between excellence and economy, a weapon built to dominate the most dangerous corners, but never meant for the massed ranks. In the end, its legacy was measured not in numbers produced, but in the certainty it offered to those who carried it into the tightest, most unforgiving spaces of the war. Today, close-quarters combat still demands absolute control, not just firepower. In an age of digital warfare, the lesson endures. The environment shapes the weapon, and purpose shapes the outcome. The Lanchester's legacy is found in every tool built for decisive moments where hesitation is fatal. In confined spaces, then and now, certainty remains the most terrifying force. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.